So why did I get invited to speak? Well, Jim Hawley and I recently have been looking at limitations of modern portfolio theory and coming up with ideas around systems investing. For those of you familiar with the investment integration project, Steve Leidenberg and Bill Burkhart and Jessica Ziegler, they're doing similar work. We're close friends, we come at it slightly different ways. But basically, systems risk says, how do I improve beta? Now, that may sound strange. We've all been taught beta is exogenous, right? It affects your portfolio, you're buffeted by it, but you can't affect it. I would call that patent nonsense. And the mere existence, for instance, of risk-on, risk-off trades are examples of people's investments influencing beta. State Street tried to influence gender diversity, is tried to influence one of the systemic risks that creates beta. Mark Carney's talking about climate risk and a climate Minsky moment. Minsky is an economist who talks about how the banks got overextended prior to the financial crisis, and all of a sudden you have a moment in which it all becomes clear. Carney's talking about that in terms of climate risk. And so you saw the industry come together pretty nicely. We should all give ourselves a pat on the back, I think, around the Paris Accords and climate risk, because we've started to recognize that this is a systemic risk. So we're trying to affect it. Not necessarily through trading the way people think we can affect it. There are a lot of other tools. I'll give you just a couple. There is divestment geared to have an impact, much like South Africa. At one point, the Philippines passed a law about 20 years ago that disadvantaged external equity investors, non-Filipino equity investors. CalPERS announced they were pulling out, made a big noise about it. The Manila Stock Exchange crashed over 3% that day, when 3% was still regarded as a big move. All of a sudden, and this is not a normal trans-Pacific flight, but there was a shuttle between Manila and Sacramento, and the Philippines changed its laws. So in effect, CalPERS affected political risk. Political risk is usually regarded as something that you try to avoid or is beyond your impact. This wasn't trading, this was negotiating and using some leverage. I already mentioned SSGA. One of the more interesting ones that I've seen recently is the largest pension fund in the world, the government pension fund of Japan, has announced that in effect, they're not looking for alpha anymore. They're so big that alpha's a blip. They are going to engage, they need to improve the Japanese economy. So they're going to engage on governance. They're going to have their managers engage on governance. And interestingly, they are going to hire environmental and socially focused managers. Not because they think they will gain alpha, although that would be nice if they do, but because they believe that by funding these types of managers, there will be more players to try to move the Japanese economy. That is beta activism, not alpha activism. It's not Carl Icahn or Bill Ackman. It's we're trying to move the marketplace. And I mentioned the Paris Accord. So what's interesting to me about this is these aren't trading. They're not what we typically think about as investing. They're not index. They're not security selection. They're using voice and polity and funding and every other way that people have to influence the systemic risks that ultimately create beta.